tremendous amount of wood pellets, over 5.76 million metric tons per year, and that's an older figure, so it's probably over 6 at this time. And each plant has a source area, a radius of about 60 miles, and that equates to about 11,000 square miles of area. And that's such that some of these plants overlap with one another relative to sources, and thus encompass a significant portion of this part of the country. In my home state of North Carolina, we have 3 operating wood pellet plants with 2 more that are proposed. And it's interesting to get a perspective. 2 of the northern plants are near the Virginia line, and those 2, in addition to the one in Virginia, require over 17 square miles of forest to be cut each year just to stay in operation. Now, the largest producer of wood pellets among all of the plants is a company called Enviva. This was founded in 2004, and it has become big enough to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange. They consume about 50 acres per day of clear-cut land in this state, and annually they are going to be sending of the 5.76 I mentioned, way over half, 3.5 million metric tons for the 7 plants that they have. Being a big corporation, they are adept financially and politically. They have received over $6 million in subsidies for their plants in the state of North Carolina from state and local governments. They've made political donations to politicians in the vicinities of these plants to the tune of $400,000, and this for some 250 jobs, most of them not exactly high-paying jobs. So what is the real concern with wood pellets, in terms of production and burning as fuel? Well, first, as Sean indicated, this is a real issue relative to climate change because of a lot of carbon dioxide is given off per megawatt hour, more so than coal. We had a professor, Dr. William Mumaw from Tufts University, document that at a hearing that I'll talk about. And so this is a severe climate change issue, particularly over there with the amount that's being generated and circulating around the earth. Air quality is another aspect. At the production plants, particulates and volatile organic compounds, particularly formaldehyde and acetaldehyde, are given off at high volumes. And then when burned for fuel, you have additional pollutants that include oxides of nitrogen and carbon monoxide. So it really gets to be an air quality issue. One of the big factors here in the North Carolina and the Southeast is habitat and biodiversity loss. The trees that are used are primarily hardwoods because they don't want pines to gum up the boilers, and thus you have a real rush to cut hardwoods, and often these are in swamp forest and lowland areas. And as such, that causes a big impact on loss of plants and animals, amphibians and reptiles, species that are only found in those wetland habitats, and that's being removed. And there was not a market for this previously, so this is a real dramatic change in forestry practice. The other side of it is that when you cut the trees don't grow back quickly enough to absorb the CO2, so you end up with an ever larger debt and more carbon dioxide being emitted over time. Final aspect that Sean also mentioned is environmental justice. A lot of these communities where the plants are sited are low income, rural, often non-white populations that don't have much financial or political clout, and they suffer a lot of problems with the air quality issues, noise from the plants, for example, and also trucks laden with these heavy loads of timber coming in there, and they are really destroying the roads and the highway infrastructure. So what have we been trying to do about it over here? Well, certainly concerned citizens, and I see two of them on the screen here, Jack Spruill and Priscilla Endo, and also other environmental groups like the Dogwood Alliance and Sierra Club got together in 2018, and we had a public meeting or a wood pellet forum, and that was held at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I believe that was August the 22nd, 2018. And we had researchers, government officials, environmental groups, and private citizens. And this was well received. We had, I think, about 100 people attended, very good media coverage. And to keep this going, this led to the creation of the Southern Forest Conservation Coalition, and that is affiliated with the Dogwood Alliance, which is a group concerned about industrial logging and its impacts in the southeastern United States. Also, there's been coordination with other organizations such as the Rachel Carson Council, Clean Air Carolina, North Carolina River Keepers, and the Sierra Club. And also, Sean mentioned movies being produced. The one we had produced was called Burned, simply, very appropriate title. We have there are two versions, a 30-minute and a shorter version, and this graphically depicts what is going on. And it is amazing to show that to audiences and the public because they're totally unaware of it. I mean, the cutting of trees are done on private property for the most part. You have these pellet mills in rural areas, and then the pellets are simply shipped to port locations, and we have one here in Wilmington, and all you see are two great big domes with kind of noisy apparatus to keep it aerated, and then put on great big ships and sent over to Europe. So public awareness has been a real key thing. And in that movie, I felt the most salient quote that was given relative to the situation was by Derb Carter, a lawyer for the Southern Environmental Law Center, who said the only thing green about wood pellets is the money it makes for investors. Also, since then, there was a webinar on October the 6th by the Dogwood Alliance and others, and concerning forests, climate, and environmental justice, and it obviously included the wood pellet issue. And finally, permitting challenges. There are ongoing issues related to air quality emissions, water discharges, and so forth in this state. The Southern Environmental Law Center has that expertise and is sort of bird dogging that, both at the proposed Inviva plant near Hamlet, North Carolina, and one that I'm less familiar with near Lumberton, with an organization called Active Energy Renewable Power. Sounds very noble, but they want to produce wood pellets. So the other thing is that what alternatives are there? Because you're dealing largely with private landowners, there has to be some incentive for them not to cut the wood. You know, they want to make money. And hopefully there can be some kind of redirection of taxes to provide incentives for the trees to be kept, for ecosystem services and so forth, such things as ecotourism, outdoor recreation. And what's particularly pertinent are buffers against flooding. We are having more and more storms here, tropical storms, hurricanes. Just had the remains of one pass through a few days ago, and the flooding is quite dramatic. And this is on top of very high development that has been occurring since 2012 with residential and retirement communities in this area of the Sun Belt. So I hope this gives you a little bit of perspective on what's going on over here.
Yeah, I'm going to just talk about what we're doing here in the situation of lockdown. We used to do huge colorful protests. We had to curtail those, obviously. But we have been doing some socially distanced, small numbered masked protests too. But anyway, there are other things that we can do from our lockdown locations. And one of them is tackle the issue of subsidies, which is the main reason why this industry is still in operation. It's subsidy driven. Drax gets over £1 billion a year for supposed renewable energy. And this is supported by the British government, but it's also supported by the European Union Parliament with the Renewable Energy Directive. And it's an appalling accounting error, along with all the harms that John has told us about, that the bioenergy industry wreaks on the planet and on human beings. There's a comical, childish accounting error in relation to the carbon. It's not counted at all on its carbon emissions, and this allows it to become, has allowed it to become a crucial element in government's pursuit of renewable energy targets. And as John also mentioned, the film Burned, there's so many wonderful quotes in that film. I've got a choice one from Bill McKibben, but I thought I'd give you the quote from Professor Bill Mumaw in that movie. And he's talking with European Union energy policy makers. And one of them turns to Bill in the film and says, "We agree with you, Bill, but we need wood to be carbon neutral or we won't meet our targets." They know that it's not carbon neutral. Successive scientific bodies have implored them to reallocate its and calculate its proper emissions. And we know that they are enormous. 300 scientists wrote a couple of years ago to the European Parliament, arguing the case that burning wood is actually more harmful than coal. And if we get back to Drax, which is the largest burner of wood in the UK, it burns 13 million tons of wood that comes across from the southern states of the USA in pellet form. It gets £1 billion a year as a renewable energy, of public money, as a renewable energy subsidy. And Drax was actually supposed to be shut down in 2009 because it failed and could not achieve the limitations on nitrogen oxide emissions. So in order to get around those, it made a deal whereby it could co-fire with wood. And as wood was classified then by the world, by the European Union in particular, as carbon neutral, the carbon factor didn't matter, but it brought the emissions just within the nitrogen dioxide emissions. And so Drax exists now because of that calculation and that business deal that was made. Another problem with Drax is that it is diverting money that should be spent on proper, true, renewable solutions to the climate crisis. Subsidies for new onshore wind and solar power have been scrapped. We've had decades of successive promises of extensive home insulation projects. In this climate, that's absolutely essential. And also with the age of the housing stock in huge parts of the country too. We need a practical, democratic home insulation program that could do a lot for the employment situation too. There's a survey done by one of the universities, and it said that the money that it took to build Drax in 1975 would have been repaid in reduced energy bills had it been spent instead on home insulation in the UK. And that bill would have been met sometime in the early years of the current century. So Drax is a great financial disaster. It's only been kept alive by the subsidies. Some years, the subsidies have been the only source of profit for the company. But also on that basis, it has been creating huge emissions. It has also now actually started feeding on the forests and habitats of the world as its fuel stocks too. And so all these dreadful things that come along with Drax's electricity would not have happened. With long-term thinking, with less profit-oriented expenditure and investment. So one other thing about Drax's efficiency is that it burns 3 trees for to extract the energy value from just 1 tree. So it's massively inefficient, as well as overly costly and directly harmful. So talking about the renewable energy subsidies, there's 2 other issues that I'd like to mention. One is demand reduction and the other is just transition. For decades, well, for a decade now, for decades we've known about demand reduction necessities and just transition, but it's all been just words. And the big trade unions must answer also for sometimes fighting in this country to preserve jobs in things like coal mining, or lobbying for the opening of new coal mines, when they are completely ignoring the issue of what kind of a working life will people have in the new environment that we are creating through global warming. So important issues, demand reduction. We after COVID, and whether Trump wins or loses the presidential election, things will get worse in climate and in the pursuit of disastrous energy policies around the world. Aviation is talking about greening itself by doing carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are more often more problematic than the purported benefits that they're supposed to bring us. So we'll have investment. The net zero is a big buzzword today amongst international bodies too, and things like in the new initiatives, when we finally get to have a COP, we know that high-tech and advanced pharmaceutical solutions, projects like climate smart agriculture, net zero, as I mentioned, and also directly in relation to bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, which is another thing that's going to justify the prolongation of Drax's business life. These will become promoted by international bodies and governments that are lobbied by international corporations. This and reforestation will be used as carbon offsets for emissions in the expanding re-energized industrial world that post-COVID will bring us. Aviation, they're still talking about building new airports in the UK. I know of 2 projects that are lobbying the government at the moment, and when we should be curtailing aviation, especially on a small island like Britain is. There should be no domestic flights. There should be affordable public transport across the island. So the people are going to go for these climate smart, high-tech solutions. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is now being run experimentally at Drax, with another huge subsidy going to Drax for that. And this plus the continued existence of Drax acts as a comfort, an example to other countries who are paradoxically expanding. While we watch on television the forests of the USA go up in smoke and wildfire, just the other day we heard that Kilimanjaro is engulfed in flames. Global warming is going to do this itself. We don't need human beings chopping down our trees and burning them because it will inevitably happen. But carbon capture, storage, net zero, all these things really only allow us to continue at the level at which we are consuming. We must have demand reduction as well. But I'm running out of time, so I think I better talk about what we would like you to do and what Biofuelwatch are doing during the COVID lockdown. And that is, we are lobbying both the UK government and with the USA, with Southern Environmental Law Centre, and the other organisations that John mentioned, Dogwood Alliance. We're promoting the Cut Carbon Not Forests campaign, which is a letter. If you go to Cut Carbon Not Forests as individual, you can find there a template letter to send to your MP, asking them to cut the subsidies. If you're an organisation, you can go to, or if you know if you're a member or know a member of an organisation that would be interested, go to the Biofuelwatch site, and there you can sign our letter to UK MPs asking them to scrap subsidies. There's also a petition that we can, you can go to the EU, and you'll find these all on the Biofuelwatch website, and asking the European Union to stop counting the burning of wood as carbon neutral and using it to achieve their falsely contrived energy targets. So there are three things we can do. I know campaigning sometimes can be dishearteningly slow, but we have had successes through the slugs. Just last year, we got the British government to agree that they would reduce the carbon emission requirements for new biomass power stations. Unfortunately, they're going to let the existing ones go on the old regime. And we've stopped the building of power stations in the UK. So successes are few and far between and don't get a lot of public attention in the press, in the media, but it is really worth anything that you can do to help stop this really counterintuitive, mad, illogical enterprise. So I'll leave it there. Two letters that you can sign and a petition. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, John and Pete, for your contributions already. I just get fascinated, keep listening to the Drax and the whole biomass stuff and what's going on in the US. And I think, as Sean said in his sort of opening remarks, it's quite incredible that we really have very little discussion about this in the UK trade union movement, where there are some many other issues which we're very split over, as natural gas and nuclear, but this is not something that raises its head very often. I think when we were asked to speak as a union as part of this session tonight, it was really about, you know, well, why is PCS perhaps standing out a bit alone against biomass and supporting the letter that Pete mentioned against the subsidies to the industry. And I think it's quite interesting. I was just looking back, and I did have the privilege also to say a few words when the film Burning Up was shown and had to dash off. But back in 2014, PCS we have an annual Green Forum with our Green reps, and we actually did a whole session on renewable energy and what is renewable energy. And interestingly, we used Drax as an example with the question, is this really a renewable energy project? And I think our conclusion was, no, it's not. And not something that we want to be supporting, and very much for the reasons, although not as well articulated, of course, as set out, because of the burning of wood, the importation of the wood, the planting of the trees, etc. And certainly I think we could go back and revisit our handout that we produced at the time and update it with this information. But I think there's things that have also moved on since then, and which are far more apparent, and clearly now we're in 2020 with the extent of the climate crisis. And I don't know if many people saw the UN report that came out yesterday or the day before around the climate disasters in the sense of natural disasters and impact on people that have just increased in the past 20 years because of climate change exacerbating those, and that's all the extreme weather events around flooding, etc., that I'm sure many people on here know so well, and why we're all here and engaged in this conversation. But also the issue of subsidies is a really interesting one, because I think, you know, that there's lots of areas where the government does do sort of hidden subsidies. And why is it subsidising? This is basically a dirty fuel, which is really of little benefit. And well, obviously it's contributing a lot to the low carbon share, if you like, of the power sector, and unfortunately far too much. But again, as pointed out, subsidies to real renewable energy have been cut a long time ago. For PCS, I mean, we would argue for no subsidies whatsoever within the power sector. Actually, what we'd argue for is public ownership and democratic control of our energy system, so that actually we can start generating under public control and public ownership. Real renewable energy, whether that's offshore wind, onshore wind, or solar power, etc. But with forms of democratic control linked into that, because I think one thing that is also clear to us as a union, and we've written about this in a number of our publications, is about having real solutions to the climate crisis, and not these false solutions that biomass presents in terms of the wood burning, particularly the carbon capture and storage. And linked in to, you know, quite interestingly, to another area where billions of money is going into it is around the blue hydrogen gas projects. And I see Ellen from Leeds TEC on here, so I'm not going to go too much to that, but I think it'd be great to have an opportunity to hear more about what the Leeds TEC is doing around a retrofit campaign in Leeds to counter the need to actually have hydrogen gas pumped into people's homes, and again come up with real solutions to decarbonising heat and retrofitting and insulation of people's homes, and which actually are really big job creators. Clearly there is not a lot of job creation around a lot of these other areas which are talked about, but unfortunately they are all heavily backed by the trade unions, and I've just found it incredulous, particularly the past 6 months or so, not just since we've been in the COVID crisis, but really since the last election. And when the Labour Party had started talking about some real shifts into renewable energy, I'm not saying we agreed with absolutely everything they were proposing, certainly thought they could go further, but there at least was some hope. But it seems now there's no shackle of these, you know, some serious contemplation around renewable energy, that the unions are going for carbon capture and storage, blue hydrogen, nuclear energy, even talking about clean coal, which I think, you know, I really thought we had got rid of in terms of the energy debate, but unfortunately it's still there, and it's going to be interesting to see what comes up in the coming months, both in the government's energy white paper that they keep talking about. But I think it's really indicative what we've just heard in this government, and I think it's a real shame of some of the green NGOs getting very excited, saying Boris Johnson is showing leadership around wind energy, for example, when all he's done is committed a paltry few million to some renewable energy projects, and actually putting loads into road infrastructure, and still obviously subsidising huge areas of the energy economy that we wouldn't agree with or be wanting to support. But I think the other thing that's really interesting as well, when we talk about just transition, and again it's a very live discussion that we're having about needing to reclaim that language to the working class. And I think one thing I bang on about a lot more recently is remembering the origins of where just transition came from, because I think this is often forgotten in a lot of our discussion. And so some of the US comrades on here will probably be familiar with Tony Mazzarchi, who was actually from the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers Union in the US, and was actually the person who really came up with this idea of a just transition. And it was very much linked to occupational health and safety, and that workers shouldn't be doing bad jobs, and that if we could actually stop some of the bad chemical factories that were getting bailed out, then why couldn't workers be bailed out and actually given a guarantee of money to retrain, and not just a kind of 6 months program, but a proper 4-year support that protected all their livelihoods, and that workers weren't sent to work into bad places that were going to affect their own health and safety, and obviously the communities in which they live as well. And I think it's worth remembering that, because although obviously the basics of a just transition is around social protections, but it was actually a very particular focus on workers not having to do bad work. We don't want to be advocating for jobs that are not going to be, we use these euphemistic terms always in the trade union, decent work, good jobs, etc. But what are those good jobs? And they certainly shouldn't be jobs that are threatening more health and safety risks for workers. For example, we've already got, outside of the pandemic, we've got a public health crisis in this country around air pollution. It's seen as the next asbestos, if you like. And it's kind of, with many things at the moment, getting forgotten in the pandemic. So I think we have to be really clear when we're advocating for the alternatives. We want real alternatives that are good for the communities, that are good for workers, and everything that goes around that. And again, in this, it's not that Black Lives Matter has just arisen over these past few months. Of course, that's been around as a movement, and the issues around that for a long time, but we really have to take care within the wider climate justice and environmental justice aspects of it all. So I think for us, particularly PCS as a trade union, this is how we now talk about our climate work in terms of climate justice. And if there isn't real justice in solutions, that isn't impacting, if things are starting to impact one group more than others, then that's not a real climate solution or climate justice solution, whether that's in this country or whether that's in another country. So clearly these things make no sense. So I think really for us, what we want to see, we're not going to see it under this government, but what we should be talking about is certainly building better understanding around what's happening around, particularly the wood pellets in biomass and places like Drax, what alternatives there are out there, and the fantastic initiatives in the Leeds TUC and other things that they're talking about in Glasgow around free public transport, that there are many other jobs that are really needed. And these are the kind of discussions that we're having around the aviation sector. And I know Tahir's on the call, so I'll leave him to say some things around that and far more expertly. But I think, we really need to start saying that let's not just look at the fact that we need renewables. What do we need our energy for? Who is our energy for? Who is this transition for? And let's create our plans around not just because we need to get rid of dirty fossil fuels, which of course we do, and just change them with renewables, but we keep absolutely everything else the same in terms of who has power, who has control, who's making money out of it, the market-driven basis of all this stuff, which is where a lot of it originates from, and is it really going to change and create jobs and communities and the kind of society and obviously the world that we all want to see. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sean, and for the invitation to speak. But I wanted to perhaps just slightly come at this from a different angle for a minute, which is that we have gone through we're going through the COVID crisis, and I think for the climate and the COVID crisis, you see that there's so many parallels. And the most fundamental parallel, obviously, is that those crises have their roots in an economic system which has prioritized the profit of very, very, very small numbers of super wealthy people globally over the needs of our public health, over the needs of the planet, over the needs of nature and our ecosystems. And those two crises clearly will not be resolved by an attempt to push us back to the system that is at the root of the problem. And I mention this because I think the focus of today's discussion is around the question of biofuels. And people have mentioned other things, aviation, Sam mentioned hydrogen, because I think that what we see around this whole question of energy and the broader question of how do we use our energy, why do we have such high levels of consumption of energy growing all the time, is because there is a very clear push to maintain the infrastructure of fossil fuel capitalism. The push to biofuels resists a transition away from the whole infrastructure that supports the fossil fuel industry. And what you often have is these moves into slightly diversified forms of energy sit very, very easily and sit simultaneously with the maintenance of a huge fossil fuel expansion, continued expansion. And this is really, I think, at the heart of the problem. There isn't a push to transition away from that infrastructure. There is a willingness to maintain that infrastructure and add on to it, if you like. And hence, we have all of the other interrelated issues that people have spoken about. It was really interesting to hear John say at the beginning about the jobs that are created around the wood pellet plants, and about the poor nature of those jobs. They are often low wage. They're often quite deregulated, private companies that resist unions, for example. And of course, the broader issue of the working class communities in which those polluting industries are placed, and also the offer of jobs is always way exaggerated over what is actually delivered. You've got the same thing in terms of airport expansion and all of this kind of sustaining of a slight diversification, but fundamentally a fossil fuel infrastructure and an economy based on motivation for an expansion on profit, which doesn't ever trickle down. And this is the other key question, a key issue. We're told that this market-based economy is necessary because it will then trickle down. But actually what we've seen for the last 30 years is it doesn't trickle upwards, it floods upwards to the very richest in society, away from the poorest, and away from investment in a basic infrastructure which allows people to live well. Now, one of the things that I think is quite important, two more points I want to make, is I think it's quite important that in the last few months of the COVID crisis, and it's clearly become very contested, as indeed the climate crisis is too, there was a brief moment of that sort of sense of social unity in which important things happened. You saw people change their behavior because they felt confident that what they were being told was true. That's not a really useful word, but you understand what I'm saying, and that their actions, collective actions, could make a difference to the outcome of our collective public health and the situation of society. Now, that obviously that social solidarity has been pushed and eaten into by the lies at the top of society, and also by a deliberate attempt to break that social solidarity, to push us all back to unsafe workplaces, get it back to business as usual, without fundamentally solving the public health crisis that we're facing as a result of the pandemic. And that weakens that social solidarity, and it's done deliberately. It has been done deliberately, and we're in that kind of situation now. But even despite that, and most particularly at the beginning of that, there is a clamour for a different kind of society. There is a clamour for a different kind of society. Survey after survey after survey indicates that people don't want to go back to business as usual. They do want jobs and livelihoods, but they want a more fundamental transition of the way that we are living. They want our relationship with nature repaired. They don't want a return to a deregulated 0 hours contract in which those kind of huge social inequalities that are played out in terms of the climate crisis and COVID, the racial, the gender, the social inequalities are reinforced yet again whilst we struggle through these crises. There is a clamour for a different kind of society. And within that, there's a clamour for socially useful work. And this keeps coming up over and over again. That people want to work in work that makes an impact, a difference in the organisation of our society, in the collective strength of our society. Now, I would say two things to finish on this, because I feel it's quite important, difficult, but quite important. People have talked about the trade union movement, and often, you know, there's nothing you can do. No, there is something you can do about it. Often the trade union is presented as a monolith, and some of the loudest voices appear to speak, to have the stage. So the voices that say we do need airport expansion within the trade union movement seem to have the stage. But there is within the trade union movement different traditions, and there always have been different traditions. There is a tradition of militancy versus social, not dialogue, social, somebody help me out here, a willingness to compromise with the existing status quo. Sam mentioned earlier the origins of just transition. You know, that comes from a tradition of militancy within the US trade union movement, a willingness to battle against employers, to organize and mobilize the strength of workers to fight for a change, a transition, a different kind of a set of social relations between workers and employers. And I think this is really important, as well as the other things that we've spoken about. I think we have to return to how do we rebuild this tradition of militancy, because unless we rebuild this tradition of militancy within the trade union movement, what we are fighting for will be crushed below the weight of a willingness to accept the business as usual approach and to take some crumbs from the table, whether that be a few crumbs of expansion in airline industry, or the opening of a wood pellet plant for the offer of a handful of jobs, as opposed to fighting for the bigger prize, which is obviously urgent. And the final point I will make is this: that people mention subsidies and money. One of the things that strikes me over and over again within this COVID crisis is the huge amounts of money that are there, the money tree that governments are able to shake when there is a political will. But when these money trees are being shaken in the last few months, the money has been shaken directly into the hands of private corporations, the Sercos of this world, the Deloittes of this world, who have a race to the bottom in terms of employment and are not delivering either the projects that they're paid to deliver, whether that be test, track and trace for us here in the UK. So as part of that building of militancy and winning of understanding around the issues that have been so eloquently explained tonight, I think we also have to fight for the idea of public sector employment, of a national climate service. We can create that employment, but it has to be employment that is planned around the needs of tackling the climate crisis and provides people with work that is framed not simply by a handful of jobs, but is framed by what do we need to do to re-establish our relationship with nature and with the climate. And that can only be done by the creation of public sector work. Our contribution to it, 1 million climate jobs, I think still very much holds up as part of that, but it's not the only contribution that has been made. So we have in the climate movement, in the anti-capitalist movement, we used to talk about we've got a world to win. I mean, it's clear we've also got a world to lose. So the urgency with which we organise becomes ever more important. And there are some actions taking place organised by People Before Profit, which are marking the end of the furlough. Well, calling for the furlough scheme to be sustained, and within that, climate jobs hopefully will be part of those protests, and that we've also got plans to do something more independently around the focus of climate jobs later on.
Neil in the audience, if he's still there, has addressed a very good question about that, and that is that it's an ever-changing landscape with all sorts of well, Neil doesn't go into it that way. He says it's very, very difficult to trace, and each new project comes up with a new set of criteria and a new purported supply chain. But they're also doing it extremely clandestinely. It's a lot of it's happening in the background, dirty deals. In one film that we were involved in, I'm not sure if it was one of yours, Sean, had wood from Ghana that had a big green stamp on it and was going off to Europe to an unknown destination with green stamped on those logs, full, mature trees. But we do all campaign in many arenas, and social justice is one that Suzanne and Sam have mentioned. John actually mentioned it in direct relation to the impacts of the wood pellet industry. Another thing is aluminium is used for a lot more things than just renewable energy. We don't approve of this whatsoever. It's absolutely appalling, and some of us are involved in campaigns to try and combat it.
I mean, there's a whole spotlight that needs to be sort of thrown over the renewable sector around a range of employment conditions. So obviously, there's a technical aspect to it, but even in employment side. So for example, in the UK, the use and abuse of foreign labour in offshore wind turbine maintenance, which has only been highlighted by offshore RMT division, for example. So you've got lots of workers there who are non-EU migrants that have been brought in under visa waivers by this government, who are paid below the national pay rates, and nobody's paying any attention to this, and it's just slowly starting to come to the surface. So I think it's another area that needs to be linked in across the board. And I think, as someone's put in the chat, I mean, it's not, this is all about climate justice all the way along. So it's not just renewables in place of fossil fuels. We have to look at everything in the round of it, and making sure that justice is at the heart, whether it's communities in India or those offshore workers or whoever else is involved.
Mm.
Well, I'm not that familiar with all of the laws and so forth. I know that dropping trees into creeks and rivers and that sort of thing is a problem, but a lot of this is sort of done way out in the middle of nowhere, and it is it's a challenging issue to say the least. Forestry industry is very strong, and I can't really speak to it in detail because I don't have that intimate knowledge of day-to-day operations to say. So maybe someone else can speak to that too.
Okay, got it right. Yeah. John has underspoken his knowledge. I'm hardly qualified to follow up from him, but if everybody is unsure, the reality is that America is a state-by-state legal system, and in some matters that we may be concerned about logging practices, it can be even more localized than within a given state. And even before the wood pellet industry arrived on the scene, there was a lot of concern about logging or land clearing right up to water's edge. And buffer zones may exist on paper, but again, a state-by-state basis are oftentimes not enforced. And that's shame on us. And again, ask the good people in the UK to solve that problem, but it is the reality of that.
Yeah, I would add that a lot of times the people who do the logging are contractors from other areas. So they kind of come in, get the stuff and go. And they may plead ignorant if there's any kind of ecological damage. But yeah, again, the riparian area is about the only area I'm familiar with. If you look at the movie Burned and also see some of these areas, they are denuded. And the thing that has always struck me is the compaction of the soil, because they're using very heavy machinery in these wet soils that are often organic soils, and it really doesn't recover. And so you lose the natural composition, the understory, and so forth. And it's never the same, unfortunately. So it's a very loose kind of regulatory situation in summary. What I can add is that there's sort of an export of wood pellets from the west coast of the United States to the Pacific Rim. Countries such as South Korea and Japan are starting to use wood pellets now. It's relatively small compared to the Southeast, but it's there, and probably will grow, unfortunately, if we're not able to stem the tide. So this is kind of a multi-headed monster in a way.
I think the way that we approach this really is that we recognise that as trade unionists wanting to campaign on just transition, that it's really important that we get our heads around some of the technologies that are being floated and actually understand, be able to differentiate between the kind of the greenwash, the kind of technologies that are being rolled out to actually as ways of preserving and prolonging the fossil fuel based capitalist system, and the ones that potentially are beneficial, and of course very much mindful that reduction of energy demand is needs to take priority. There have been a number of reports published recently talking about the vast number of jobs that could be produced, that could be created by having a mass retrofit programme for really almost all of the UK's housing stock, but certainly the large proportion of it that at the moment is less than an energy performance certificate standard of C, which is a fairly minimal standard. What you can actually do with a proper deep retrofit is reduce energy demand for the home to about 20% of what it is currently on average. So that makes a huge difference to the kind of demand that's being made on renewable energy systems. We've had a little bit of pushback, I would say, since producing this document. Two reasons. One of the reasons is that we're specifically calling on on our local authority to coordinate a project which would really kickstart the mass retrofit by, for example, by retrofitting a lot of its own. We've still got a lot of council housing in Leeds, which is a benefit, and a lot of housing association homes. So there is that's a good starting point. And what that can do then is to provide potentially work destinations for trainees, because we've got the Leeds Building College, which is at the moment, I understand, struggles to be able to fill courses in energy efficient construction and retrofitting, because the work destinations are not there, and also the apprenticeship opportunities or the work experience opportunities are not there. So one of the things that needs to happen is if local authorities can institute large projects that can provide a kickstart in all kinds of ways to getting the training happening, to getting a skilled workforce available that can actually do this work, bringing prices down in the supply chain, producing jobs in the supply chain, all of this. But obviously the big stumbling block is the local authorities are absolutely on their knees. They have been after 10 years of cumulative cuts in their central budgets, and now being literally into millions of pounds of loss because of the revenue loss and the extra expenses of the COVID crisis. They're just absolutely absolutely in tatters. They're barely functioning, and Leeds is better than most places in the country, I believe. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think we have a little bit of pushback from certain elements in the trade union movement as well, because of, I think, really a bit of what Sam was hinting at, that you've got a lot of the existing jobs in carbon-intensive industries have been the traditional, pretty well-paid, often very, very masculinized jobs as well. And when there's a focus on defending those jobs at all costs, what you then get is an alliance between those sections of the workforce and the and basically the industry push to protect things like jobs in natural gas extraction, for instance, by inventing well, what we're looking at in Leeds specifically, and in the north, is that they're desperately looking for markets for blue hydrogen, which is the hydrogen that is produced by reformation of methane and produces a huge amount of carbon dioxide, which then is supposedly disposed of through carbon capture and storage technology. Now, this is the same as what's being proposed for Drax, which is also in our region. So it's all tied in together, and I think this is where the pushback comes, because in our document, we've actually made a reference to the fact that we generally don't approve of carbon capture and storage as a means of disposing of emissions from the burning of any carbon-based fuels. So there's an implicit reference in there to the use of biomass with carbon capture and storage at Drax, but there's also a reference to the blue hydrogen, which there are proposals to actually use for domestic heating to replace natural gas, and this is an absolute nonsense, because it's for reasons that people have talked about, but because it's all tied in together, that because we're saying that we don't want blue hydrogen being pumped into our homes, and that being tied in with carbon capture and storage, that people who are wedded to other applications of carbon capture and storage, be it for the biomass at Drax, or be it for industrial applications around the Humber, for example, in our region, heavy industries there, they feel under threat by this idea that no, we don't want what we want is we don't want hydrogen being pumped into our homes. What we want is for them to be deep retrofitted, so that they only need a fraction of the energy that they currently need, and therefore they can be fitted with heat pumps, and that can be adequate. And we're not going to need need carbon-based fuels at all. So it feels like the sort of politics of this are actually quite complicated, and we can get pushback from places that we don't necessarily expect it. However, on the positive side, people have read our document, and trades councils in other parts of the country have taken it up. I mean, I was invited to talk at a meeting in Islington, and we've had somebody went to a meeting at Medway TUC. We've got one in Wakefield TUC, and people are interested in what we're doing, and there are other trades councils doing similar campaigns in different parts of the country. So hopefully we can get this get people linked up together and create a campaign which is actually big enough to have an impact on the central funding and the policy frameworks that are needed to enable this to happen.
I can tell you, Jack, that sadly the Liverpool Dockers Union are not what they were. There was a massive struggle in the 90s, which they sadly were defeated in the end.
Yeah, not really so much to add, and I mean, certainly, Sean, you're right. I mean, you know, where are the Dockers unions these days? But I think it's this point of kind of what we've lost really, and Suzanne was touching on some of this around militancy in the trade union movement and this kind of solidarity struggles that we have in solidarity actions. Now in the UK, a lot of that is clearly linked to the anti-trade union laws and some of the most repressive anti-trade union laws in the whole of Europe, and we've got plenty more coming down the line, I don't doubt. But I think it's just that's also part of building our campaigns as well. I mean, we had a really good history around some of this solidarity types of work of, you know, blocking stuff at the ports, and whether it was you know, particularly around not to undermine other workers' struggles, whether that's in the UK or whether that's internationally. We've had some really good stuff obviously around the military agenda as well. But I think these are all things that we have to build, and I think most of us who are sort of actively involved in the trade union movement, for sure, on all these issues, are really thinking more about how we bring these kind of discussions into our sort of day-to-day struggles and work. And I think that kind of shone through last year when we had these ideas around the global climate strike, and how difficult, I mean, outside of the fact that we don't have a right to strike in this country, but it's very difficult to strike. But actually, how would workers, or, you know, how would you get workers to actually come out and strike around some of this stuff? And we are perhaps moving into a better opportunity to do that, just because yes, we've had the moment of where we had some wider sort of social solidarity around the COVID crisis, but I think with the socio-economic crisis that's coming down the line, a much greater awareness of, obviously, you know, the talk around the green recovery and what that really means and what that should look like, and the jobs that could be had. I mean, the tragedy of the workers, and we're seeing this particularly in the aviation sector and the oil and gas sector, you know, tens of thousands of workers being laid off. Their skills are just going to go completely to waste, whereas they could be now put on schemes and retraining, etc., for the future work. I mean, the problem is running alongside it. Of course, we don't have the real plan to create those jobs and put the workers into, which clearly we'll be wanting to do around 1 million climate jobs type work and a national climate service. But I'm just assuming that there will be increasing more frustrations that actually this huge wasted and lost opportunities. And, you know, some of us that were sort of on the back end of the employment crisis in the 1980s, and I was certainly one of them. I mean, when I was leaving school in the 80s, we were saying about your future career prospects was we used to put down unemployment because we actually didn't see any future career prospects, and things are a lot worse now than they were then. So I think we've really, you know, as a trade union movement, as a labour movement, and it's not just in the UK, obviously, it's going to be internationally, you know, we have to work collectively together to get to the solutions that we want to, and, you know, and very practical things like the Leeds TEC retrofit project, I think, you know, gives some good, clear ideas and tangible things that we can fight for and can be done through a pro-public agenda in which local authorities could actually get behind.
Thanks, Sam. And I mean, just on dockers generally, I mean, we did see like an incredible strike by longshoremen in the States not so long ago, shutting down the entire West Coast in support of Black Lives Matter, as well as the plans to privatise Oakland docks. So
we do work with Indigenous groups around the world. You know, we try and engage, build a link between here in London being the belly of the beast for most of those corporations. They're registered in the City of London, their AGMs are in the City of London. And when mining companies and stuff are holding their AGMs, we do try and bring people from the indigenous populations of those countries to come and raise questions at those AGMs. It's a huge thing that's very, very difficult to make traction with. But what little we can find to do, we can do. And that on the supply chain, we're told that the wood used for wood pellet manufacture is offcuts and thinnings. And you raised the question that, like, if there is an audit of the offcuts, then there ought to be a volume of wood that was then used for commercial purposes. So it should match what's claimed to be the offcuts that are used for things. We know they're using whole trees. We've seen them. Jack and I have been to Carolina and I've seen them on the backs of trucks. But if we could quantify the quantity of wood that is registered for use, then we should be able to quantify the bogus claims for offcuts. Is that a possibility in our investigative work?
My only recollection is that, yeah, this was the old corporate narrative that they were using scrap wood and so forth. And then I believe it was Dogwood Alliance put observers at the mills and saw the whole logs coming in. So I think that was corporate happy talk, and it was pretty much shot down by the reality of what they're getting.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody who's turned up today. Particular thanks to all the speakers for finding the time to set off what's been a really good discussion. I think we do need to think about, like, rather than just saying we need to go over to renewables, we need to think about where those renewables are coming from and who is impacted by that. That has to be central in what we're doing. And I think, as a lot of people are saying, this points to a lot less energy use and a lot more localized production, which maybe doesn't use the capitalist modes of productions that we're using at the moment, but thinks about a completely different way of doing things in a completely different economy. But I'd just like to say thank you for everybody for turning up. Please try and get as many union branches and organisations as you can to sign Biofuelwatch's open letter. If we can do one thing when we go away today, maybe if by the end of the week we can get 20 more union branches signed up for that, that would be brilliant. But even one more over the next couple of days would be great. And thanks to everyone for coming, and see you all soon.